Hi, Professor. My name is Linda Nguyen, and this is my presentation on Chapter 4 for the critical analysis video. So starting off with explaining the public and private spheres, as well as where men and women fit in these two spheres. Starting off with public spheres, public would refer to more of the social interactions that everyone had outside of their home, and that made private refer to anything that happened domestically with their families and just within the house. And specifically in this era, public spheres would refer mostly to men and their work because women and their families were majorly dependent on the male wage. And moving on to private spheres, in this era, private spheres would refer to domestic life, including woman and home, and women being very pure and submissive. So they completely listen to the man, and this also connects to the idea of Republican motherhood that happened in the previous era, where women were meant to be at home and educate their children to be very virtuous and very moral for the country's future. And here are some pictures on the right. Moving on to how women slowly made their way into the public sphere, how they justify their presence, and what specific reforms and movements did they use. So, in order to make their way into the public sphere, they first decided that they would create an all-girls school. And it was based entirely on Christian principles, and they decided that this was an opportunity to educate themselves. After educating themselves by 1850, most of the southern women or northern women at this time were literate. And they decided that this was another opportunity for them to make bigger things, follow their feminist ideas, and they justified their presence in the public sphere by asserting a moral mission to teach. So they justified having a moral objective, a moral cause to be outside and interacting with people. And they specifically did this by engaging in a social reform or religious revival, also known as the Second Great Awakening. Here's some quotes on the school being based on Christian principles, how most white women were basically literate at this time, and they acquired the tools to analyze and debate their place on feminism, and how they engaged in the social reform outside of the home. And on the right are some few pictures. Now, moving on to if Southern women created these same associations found in the North, why or why not? So they weren't really able to, although they did attempt, and this was because in the South, slavery was a lot more prevalent than in the North because of some of the laws that happened and just how some people in the South did not want to get rid of slavery. They were very adamant about keeping it because it most likely made their lives a lot easier, although it wasn't very moral. And in this time, they decided that, or it was just a known thing that fathers ruled over women, children, and slaves. And so we can see a little bit here that there's a lot of power given to the fathers, and women, children, and slaves were very low. And at this time, as for what I mentioned about attempting, they did attempt to gain freedom or solidarity by going to organized benevolence, finding churches, and it was an environment that they could organize themselves with some autonomy. So they did find a bit of freedom there in the churches and organized benevolence areas. However, at this time, subordination of women and racism, as well as slavery, was far too authoritative. So they weren't really able to do much within their lives, or of course, because the slave owners dictated their lives with the food, shelter, how long they were contracted, and just basically life itself. These people couldn't really go against the patriarchy unless, of course, something was done with the law. And so they didn't really create these same associations. Here are some pictures on the right, and those are the quotes that I used. And this concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for listening.